Thank you very much. I originally wasn't planning on telling this story today, but scurrying around, getting the microphones all set up, I decided I'd share one of the most bizarre experiences I've ever had as a speaker. And what's interesting is oftentimes when I talk on stress, it's the most stressful talk that I do. In fact, my computer crashed and I lost hours of preparation that wasn't backed up getting ready for this, and I'm afraid I wasn't going to get my deadline. But the situation that came into my mind as I was scurrying around, making sure the technology was working, it was the first time I'd ever been invited to do a keynote at a conference. And so what I did was what oftentimes we do in situations that are new and different. I scared myself to death, just like Fran was talking about earlier. And not only did I scare myself because I had found a whole bunch of new research that I wanted to share with people, but I couldn't figure out how to put it together in a coherent way. And as I'm flying over, I'm thinking, I got to get it together pretty soon because the talk's coming. So between scaring myself over it, and also I turned that one incident into, and if I don't do well, it'll destroy my career. I mean, isn't it amazing how we do that? We what's called catastrophize. So I'm stressing myself over this talk, and incidentally, the talk was on trauma, so I'm traumatizing myself. Well, between stressing myself out and for 14 hours in the air, from LA to Sydney, sitting next to Typhoid Mary, this lady like coughing and sneezing all over me. By the time I arrived, there we go, gotta love the microphones. By the time I arrived, I had her cold. And so here's the situation. My head's all stuffed up, and I sound horrible, but I didn't want to take any cold medicine because at a seminar, I don't know, about a year before, I'd taken way too much cold medicine. And I remember it like it was yesterday because I really wanted people to get this point. And I said, with tremendous import, it's so important to remember. And then it was like nothing, absolutely, like the hard drive crashed. So I'm thinking, I don't want that to happen here, so no cold medicine. But instead what that meant was, I sounded like this. So as I'm walking onto the stage, I'm feeling really self-conscious, and I'm feeling bad for the audience that they have to listen to this voice for the next 90 minutes. But as I walk onto the stage feeling self-conscious, a little concerned, that fear disappeared because a more pressing fear emerged, and that was, remember, no cold medicine. I forgot Kleenex and my nose was starting to run. And so obviously it's not an option. So 5 minutes in, the faucets are turned on big time. I need to get out of there. So I come up with, on the spur of the moment, an exercise for people to do, and I get out of there. And I find a bathroom, stuff toilet paper in my pocket, blow my nose, blow my nose, blow my nose, blow my nose. Finally, I can breathe, and I'm ready, and I'm prepared, and I'm ready to go back, and I'm excited to share my message. I'd finally gotten it together on the flight over. I wouldn't have been so excited about returning if I'd realized the whole time I was blowing my nose, my wireless mic was on. Yeah. Of course, it was recorded. And when I got back from the trip, I remember thinking, did it really sound that bad? It did. When I played it, I'm like, oh my God. I'm not exaggerating. It literally sounded like, and it went on and on and on. And as I'm listening to it, I'm like, this sounds like a flock of monster geese that's never ending. So remember, I have no idea I'm broadcasting. I come back on stage like, hi, I'm back. I get this major round of applause. And I thought they were just happy to see me until somebody announced why they were applauding. So hopefully I will de-mic after I'm finished here. But the story actually that I wanted to start off with captures the essence, or at least part of the essence of what I want to share with you. And here's what happened. Several years back, I was rummaging through a box of audio tapes, and I came across a tape actually that a friend of mine had made. It was a tape letter. It was back before email and back before long-distance calls were so cheap. And so we would send tape letters back and forth. And I was curious. I noticed the date on it, and it was for, like, say, 2 years earlier. And I thought, I wonder what was going on with her back then. So I plopped it in a tape deck and I started to listen. And it's interesting, as I heard her tell her story, it was this really surrealistic experience. Because here's what was happening. She was going through a major life transition. That she was walking away from a career that she had loved for many years, but it no longer fit who she was. And some of you here might be in that position. Not only was she walking away from that career, and she was very successful in it, but also as part of this transition, she had sold her house. And here's the problem. She had sold her house, but she hadn't found a new place to live. And so there was this limbo of, now what? What am I going to do if I don't find a place in time? Where do I put my stuff, etc.? And it was touching, it was sweet, it was poignant because I could hear her understandable anxiety, in her voice, but also she was trying to be really brave and joke about the situation. But the surrealistic part of it is imagine a split screen on a TV. On this screen is her speaking from the past, from 2 years ago, in the moment of that change, challenge, and uncertainty. On the other split screen, I'm here 2 years in the future, knowing exactly how the story turns out. And she finds exactly this place that is wonderful, that totally fits who she is and nourishes her. And so while she was having the understandable anxiety and angst, I had complete serenity in knowing that everything is going to turn out just right. And later I found myself thinking, isn't that what we all want when we're in the midst of that transition? And that's one of the gifts I see of resilience. The more we do the work to cultivate resilience, the more we're able to face challenging times with a sense of serenity and courage and optimism. And so that's one of the things that today's work can make a difference in ways that it can make a difference in your life. But there's another aspect of resilience that I think is really important to appreciate. And that is, it's not just about surviving, it's about thriving. Several years ago, a friend of mine decided that he was going to hike in the Andes. And he was smart, even though he was already a fit guy, he went through a conditioning program. And he had put bricks in his backpack and really challenged himself physically because he knew how rigorous it was going to be. And because he put in the effort to engage in that conditioning program, he had enough energy and vitality to be hiking in those high elevations. If you've ever tried to hike in high elevations, that's pretty tough. Forget the hiking part, just the trying to breathe part is hard. Because he got himself at a level of conditioning that allowed him to deal with the challenges of this adventure, he had enough energy and vitality to enjoy the camaraderie of being with his friends and enough energy and vitality to enjoy the incredible scenery. And I see that as one of the big other differences that resilience makes in our lives, that we're able to have a lot more energy so we're able to enjoy this journey. All our energy isn't just focused on dealing day to day. So I share those sort of what's in it for you stories because to truly develop resilience does take work. And today is just the beginning of, hopefully for many of you, an ongoing practice for increasing your resilience. And you won't do that practice unless you really believe it'll make a difference. So here's what we'll talk about. I'm going to share with you a couple tools, a couple guiding principles, and a couple practices. And what I try to do is select out of the bigger program some of the principles and tools and practices that have made the biggest difference in my life. So that's what we'll be doing. Now, sometimes you kind of feel that way, huh? Here's what's interesting. The research on stress and health is the research shows that it's the daily hassles, that's what the researchers describe it. It's the daily hassles that have the biggest impact on our overall stress level, more so than major life events. Therefore, it's imperative that we get good at managing the daily hassles, to not sweat the small stuff. Also, though, the way I think of developing the skills to deal with the daily hassles, if we practice on the little things that annoy us and bug us and frustrate us, we develop those skills so that we can apply them to the big things. And what I found to be my own personal most useful stress management tool is what I call instant perspective. And I think of it as sort of the all-purpose cleaner when it comes to stress management, because it's like those all-purpose cleaners. You can use them in all types of situations. I've used instant perspective in situations where I'm frustrated, when I'm angry, when I'm embarrassed, situation where I'm stressing myself out. Now, the usefulness of instant perspective hit me when I was in my early 20s. And what happened was, there was a lady that I had a crush on. And when you think of situations where, whether it's, a youngster and you have a crush on somebody, or maybe it's as an adult and you're trying to impress somebody professionally, how instead of just being who we are, we try to amp it up so they're impressed by us, like us, etc. Well, that's what I'm doing. And whenever I would get together and talk with her, I would always sort of monitor, like, how am I coming across? Is she finding me interesting? Am I a big dummy? That sort of thing. Well, I remember this one visit. I was telling her my tale of woe. I had gone to graduate school to become a wildlife biologist. Go figure, here I am now. Discovered early on that was not the career I thought it was. So I'm telling her my tale of woe, my discovery about I don't really like this career that I thought I always wanted. And I wasn't sure if I was fascinating enough for her. And so I was really dialing up the drama level. Yeah, exactly. Oh no, bad idea. So as I'm telling about being on this roller coaster of emotions, the highs and the lows, then with this like full-on gusto and drama that only a 20-something can do, I say, well, what I meant to say was, every day I run the whole gamut of emotions. But instead, because I'd never heard somebody pronounce gamut, I'd only read it in books. Here's a tip. Let somebody else blaze the trail for you, pronouncing a word. Out of my mouth with full drama was, every day I run the whole gamut of emotions. And again, even though I'd never heard anybody pronounce it, I'm thinking, wow, doesn't sound too good. So as soon as I get home, and I'm not making this up, I run to my dictionary. Oh, gamut. Oh. Two things happen for about the next year. And think about how you do your own version of this. Number one, whenever I would get together with her, no matter what the topic, I found a way to slip in gamut. The other thing that I would do, and think about how you do this, we all do this, when I wasn't around her, I would just replay it over and over. It's kind of like, no, those kind of slow-mo things. And then if that's not bad enough, I would turn into like Stephen King, and I would make my own like horror film festival of her telling her friends about this moron who says whole gamut of, again, you know how we do that. We torment ourselves. So finally, I couldn't stand the suspense of whether my, quote, subtle approach was working with slipping the gamut in. So let's say a year goes by, and when I get together, I get up my courage, and I say, feels awkward to talk about this, but I still feel embarrassed. You know that time I said I ran the whole gamut of emotions? And of course, what'd she say? Exactly. What? What are you talking about? That took a while to sink in. Like, I am not the center of your universe? Oh, shocking. But then later I thought about it. It's like, look at what you did. You tormented yourself for a year over something that she has no memory of. How bright was that? But also, you tormented yourself for a year over something that now you laugh about. And so one of the ideas that I really like is that whole idea of misery is optional. And just pass on the misery. It's like if you ever go through a fast food place and they say, would you like fries with that? whenever we go through hard times, like the universe says, would you like misery with that? You say, no, I'll pass on the misery. And so one of the simple ways of passing on the misery is instant perspective. And how you do that is asking a really simple question. And I know you've used this question, which is this going to be a big deal a year from now? So if you're feeling frustrated, if you're feeling angst-ridden, if you're upset about something, ask yourself, is this going to be a big deal a year from now? And you think about it, for most things in life, they're not even going to be a big deal later on in the day. So why should I make myself miserable and as part of that pump not so healthy biochemicals throughout my body? So here's what I want to ask you to do. Just a minute. And I really want to ask you to be really focused when I ask you to come back. If you could definitely come back. I don't want to have to like shout. And we've got a lot that hopefully I want to share with you. For just 1 minute to share with somebody, preferably somebody new, what kind of situation do you stress yourself out over that you could use instant perspective with? Okay? So we'll just do 1 minute and then we'll come back together. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so that's instant perspective. Now, a guiding principle, possibly the most, it's one of the two principles I found in my life that have made the biggest difference in terms of developing greater resilience. And that's understanding the power of our thoughts and words. Let me tell you a couple quick stories. A friend of a friend told a group of people the story where he was, when he was in Little League, he was like one of those Charlie Brown kind of athletes, and he was on a team of Charlie Browns. So they were 0 wins all season. Well, the end of the season, they happened to play the best team in the league. Now, it's the bottom of the 9th or whatever the equivalent is in Little League, and there's 2 out and there's 2 boys on base, 0-0. He has the chance of either, Charlie Brown world, a GOAT, or the hero. Here's the problem. This friend of a friend is Jim. Jim's a horrible batter. Talk about the pressures being on. So he's starting to freeze up, and his coach calls him over, and he says, Jim, I want you to bunt down the third base line. And Jim's kind of like, deer in the headlights. Coach is, Jim, bunt down the third base line. Finally, it sinks in. Jim's like, all right, coach. So he gets up to the bat, and he's like programming himself, bunt down the third base line, bunt down the third base line. Pitcher winds up and throws. Jim, just like he's programmed, bunts right down the third base line. And then Jim starts to run down the third base line. It's funny because he said, you think the third baseman was surprised? You should have seen the pitcher when I'm running from third to first. And I love that story because it's such a perfect metaphor for what Earl Nightingale spoke about years ago. We become what we think about. We become what we think about. And so I want to ask you to think about, what do you think about? If we're constantly focusing on what's wrong with us, that expands. If we focus on our strengths and our talents, that expands. If we're facing a challenge and we're focusing on all the things that we're not able to do about it, that are outside of our control, that becomes bigger. If we focus on the things we can, you get the picture. We become what we think about. Also, what's really helpful in the realm of understanding how thoughts affect us is something called explanatory style. And in your handouts, I've got references so you can build on this. Remember, this is just the beginning of an ongoing process. And the concept of explanatory style was made famous by Dr. Martin Seligman. And I'll give you an example of this right now. Related actually to what Fran talked about, it's not what happens to us that affects us, it's the meaning we make of what happens. So I'll give you an example. When my daughter Jessie was about 2.5 or 3, I remember picking her up and putting her in the car seat. And just as I'm about to do that, this boy glides by on a skateboard. And being like an incredibly extroverted little kid, she goes, "Hi, do you want to play with me?" And he, of course, like totally ignores her and skates on by. Now, ever the psychologist, I'm thinking, I wonder how she's making sense of that. And it's great. Jessie looks at me and she goes, "Oh, Daddy, look, the boy is shy. He doesn't talk." And I'm thinking, when she gets to dating age, I hope she has that same attitude. And it was interesting because I just did an interview yesterday and I shared on resilience and I shared that story. And this lady called in and said, "I just had a similar experience." I just want to share it with you because it's short and it's really cool. She said that she had put her hat in the ring in one of those electronic dating sites. And she said that this man expressed interest in her, but I guess the site has where you don't show your picture unless you both agree at a certain point. And the guy on his description said that he was interested in women who are above average intelligence. Above average in looks, okay? So she gives him access to her picture, and then she never hears from him again. So she says, and it's so perfect, she says, at first I'm thinking, I guess he thought I was not above average. And then she said, but then I thought, well, I'm just making it up anyways. Why don't I make it up in a good thing? Maybe he's intimidated, like I'm way out of his league. Isn't that great? It's like, it's made up no matter what. Why don't I pick the good one, the one that feels good? So it's not what happens to us, it's how we explain it to ourselves. And I really encourage you to explore Dr. Martin Seligman's work because he has some really groundbreaking research on the difference in explanatory style between people who get depressed, people who are pessimistic, people who are optimistic. The other part of becoming really aware of what we think and what we say relates to becoming adept at identifying and challenging all the crazy stress-producing thoughts we engage in. There's a whole body of work, actually there are multiple bodies of work that deal with this. One of them is the work by Dr. Albert Ellis. And actually I did not put him in the handouts. I recommend you Google Dr. Albert Ellis. He's one of the pioneers in talking about how self-talk affects emotions. And one of the ways that one of the terms that he uses that is so simple for you to take away, to keep in mind, is awfulizing. And he said how we awfulize things. And that the situation I mentioned before about how my computer crashed and I lost 3 hours of work and I had a deadline for this conference. And here's what was kind of cool. Because I was so immersed in all this, preparing for this program, I totally chilled. I did zero awfulizing. I didn't have to step back from the edge like sometimes I have to do with fighting the crazy making self-talk. And so Dr. Albert Ellis is also Dr. Aaron Beck's work. And I'll just give you one example because I really want you to work with this. And actually in the appendix, I've given you a whole bunch of examples of thinking errors from Dr. Beck's work. But one of the classic ones that we all engage in at times is mind reading. Think of how often you've gotten an email from somebody and the email had an attitude. Is that true? The email didn't have an attitude. We projected the attitude into it. What's up with them? They're being really brusque, really abrupt. Well, maybe they're on their BlackBerry and they were rushing from meeting to meeting. They didn't want to write a War and Peace novel. And so there's no attitude there. We just project into it. So one of the things as a master of mind reading, not the good way, the bad way. I can speak to the importance of constantly challenging that. And there's a whole bunch of other thinking areas that I really encourage you to work with. So becoming really tuned into what am I thinking and how is it affecting both how I react to frustrations, hassles, pressures in day-to-day life, as well as how am I reacting to major challenges. Here's a perspective that I have found personally to be so powerful. Several years back, it was a hot September day, and I was doing some power walking. And because of a knee injury, I can't run, so I try to walk as fast as I can to get some cardio going. And so I'm walking as fast as I can, but the problem was there were all these little caterpillars that growing up we called them woolly bears, the little brown ones with a little black stripe. They were all catching rays on the road. And I was feeling bad for them because they were not long for the world. But I wanted to get the cardio thing happening, so I wasn't going to like, here, little woolly bear, like that. So what I decided to do is I took my shirt off and I was just like, whoosh, whoosh, whoosh as I'm walking down the road. And it just dawned on me, like, I wonder what people thought as they're driving by. I never really thought about that part. But the part that I was focusing on was the woolly bear's perspective, if they indeed have one. But you think about it, one moment you're hanging loose, enjoying the sun. The next moment you're like flying into the bushes. And I was thinking, isn't this just like a perfect metaphor for life when we go through change, challenge, and uncertainty? That from our ground level perspective, we get fired, we lose a job, we have a life-threatening illness. It's horrible, it's frightening, it's traumatic. But from a higher perspective, in this case, I could see what they could not, it was really a gift. And it's so hard to have that perspective when you're the one getting punted off the road into the bushes. And so one of the practices that I have found incredibly useful is learning to tune your brain when you're facing difficulties. Because it's natural when we're facing a difficult situation. I don't know if you know this, but the Chinese character for crisis is a combination of two characters. It's so easy for us to focus on the danger, the fear, the stress part of it. We don't tune into, unless we discipline ourselves, that other Chinese character, opportunity. I remember years ago, Dennis Waitley saying it so beautifully, that crisis is opportunity riding a dangerous wind. And so here's something I'd like to ask you to do. To just take a moment on your own and reflect on a crisis in your life that happened years ago that at the time you felt like the woolly bear. You were focused, understandably so, on the trauma, the fear. But now looking back from a bigger perspective, you see that there was a hidden gift or it opened a door for you. So there was an opportunity. So just a minute on your own and then we'll come back. Okay? Just a minute on your own. And here's what I'd like to ask you to do. Later, spend more time on that, whether you write it down or just think about it in your mind, because there's a purpose for this. It's not just a feel-good thought that in every crisis there's also opportunity and gifts. But here's what we know about the brain. There's a part of the brain called the reticular activating system. Its job is to act like a radar, to scan the environment for stimulus or stimuli that is relevant to you. And when it picks up on stimuli that are relevant, it locks on. It's sort of like this. You can relate to the reticular activating system in action. When you've decided to buy a car and you decide on a certain make or model, you notice that car everywhere. Yeah. Isn't that true? And it's not like the night before everybody else bought theirs. It was never relevant to you. Now it is. So the reticular activating system locks on. Okay. When you convince yourself from your own experience that there are hidden gifts and hidden opportunities in every crisis, and you really know that from your own experience, you tune your brain to be able to pick up on those. That if we were just lost in fear, we're not able to see those. To control attention means to control experience and therefore the quality of life. And so by tuning our brain, we're not always focusing on our attention on what's wrong or what's fearful. We're focusing our attention like a bloodhound on a scent, the scent of opportunity. Whoops. Choose challenge. This is the other principle besides being aware of how our thoughts affect us and being aware of challenging limiting beliefs and limiting self-talk that made the biggest difference in my life. I'll tell you why. I had a summer job that absolutely changed my life. And what happened was I was, like many of you here, I was putting myself through college, which meant, as those of you who've done that, meant I was very poor. So I didn't have a car to go to school. I had to hitchhike, which got really old really quickly. So working the basic summer jobs, I couldn't afford to go to school and have a car. But a classmate of mine told me about this job he got the summer before that he was able to make like 3 times of what I made. So I'm thinking, sign me up. Here's the deal, though. The job was selling books door to door. Small problem. I was so painfully shy, and my self-image was so fragile that, let's say you're at the grocery store and you're checking out and you're talking to the clerk. I couldn't say, hey, how you doing, and smile at the clerk, because if they didn't smile back, if they just did that, duh, yeah, what do you want, look, I would feel crushed and rejected. Trust me, selling books door to door, have somebody not smile at you is the least of your worries. Fortunately, ignorance is bliss. I had no clue what I was signing up for. Now, I grew up in Connecticut, and even though I was living on my own, I still have lived a pretty sheltered life. I go from living that life to going to sales school in Nashville, Tennessee, to a bunch of guys and I drive in an old Ford Maverick, some of you remember those cars, up to Fort Wayne, Indiana. We get there Saturday morning, and we had given our little pledge, we're going to start selling our books bright and early Monday morning. We had no place to stay, so job one was find an abode. We had gotten 2 references from the company. We split up our references. One of the guys and I call ours, and it's a minister. And he said, you had given your name as possible. And he's like, oh, yeah, right. I don't have a place, but you can talk to my nephew. So okay, good. We call up the nephew, and he sounds a little puzzled by this call. But he's like, come on over. So we come on over, and now we see why he's puzzled, because the nephew runs a halfway house for the chronically mentally ill. And I'm thinking, was it something about us that made the minister connect the dots here? Now picture yourself living a sheltered life. For the first 2 weeks of this scary gig, we're living in a halfway house. Later on, we did find a room in a house. But that summer, every single day, I was outside my comfort zone. In fact, the first day at work, I remember I was so frightened. When I knocked on the door and the lady opened the door, I went mute. I just... and she's like, oh, thank you. Book, But that summer changed my life because it taught me the only way to have more courage and confidence in the world is to step outside our comfort zone. That we can either avoid fear by huddling in the corner and hiding from life, or we can step out into life and into the unknown. So what I mean by choosing challenge, it doesn't mean taking up hang gliding or jumping out of airplanes. It means in little moments of truth in everyday life, when you can choose something that's easy for you versus something that feels a little challenging, choose the challenge. I'll give you a quick example. several years ago, I did a talk at, actually it was another local conference. It was up at Samoset. And a friend of mine who was an exhibitor there came up to me and she said, hey, we're getting together a bunch of people. We're going to this really awesome restaurant in town. Love for you to come. Now, I had already planned, because I was doing the keynote that morning, I had already planned to have a quiet night alone, review my talk, yet again, and get really focused. So I'm thinking about this option, and I'm really wanting to have the night alone, but I'm thinking, well, this might be a good thing. But then I started thinking about a big group, like 10 or 12 people, probably nobody there I know. Now, even though I do this for a living, I'm basically an introvert, okay? Those of you who are introverts, or those of you who just don't like small talk, what do you think about the idea of being stuck for hours with many people you don't know coming up with conversation? Choose a root canal over that, right? So I'm thinking, oh, thanks, great, okay. No, I don't think so. But then as I thought about it, it's like, wait a minute. The only way for you to feel more comfortable in the world is to step outside your comfort zone, so go for it. But then the other part of me is thinking, like, what about if it's like really boring? I don't like chit-chat. Like, no, this is good for you. And I started to become like Gollum in Lord of the Ring, like nasty hobbitses, good hobbitses, nasty. It's like going back and forth. And then she comes up an hour or two later. She goes, hey, just want to let you know, we rented a courtesy van, so you can drink if you want. What are you thinking if you're in my situation? Definitely no. Then I'm really stuck. It's really no control over this. The very reason that I didn't want to do it, because it was anxiety producing, was the reason why I did it. And it actually turned out to be one of the most fun times I've ever had at a conference. Now, I remember the question that somebody asked Fran about what about if it didn't go well with the conversation. If it hadn't have gone well, I would have bought myself something. What I mean by that is, if you go for it and it doesn't go well, you want to teach your brain taking risks is okay. And so treat yourself. So either you get to feel good because it went well, or if it didn't go so well, you get to you feel good because you treated yourself with something. So here's what I want to ask you to do, is just for later, think about what are opportunities where I feel a little anxious, I could step outside my comfort zone. And maybe even today at this conference, maybe striking up a conversation here with somebody that looks kind of like a cool person, and you'd like to meet them, and usually you hang back and wait for people to introduce themselves for you. So this is such an awesome group, as you can tell. This is a great place to practice, and you can even announce, I'm stepping outside my comfort zone, and ladies like, no, not with me. Okay? So, I love this quote, be systematically heroic in little unnecessary points. Dr. William James. So the more we practice being brave in little simple everyday life, like say returning an item without the receipt. Like some stores act like you're a felon if you don't have the receipt. And you're more like, it's not worth it. Just the fact that you feel a little anxious, something like that. Practicing being systematically heroic. It takes practice. Imagine a friend of yours who says, I am going to get really fit this year, and I'm going to go to the gym once. You're like, you need to get a grip on reality. It's the same thing with resilience. And so I really hope you think of this as like a home page. So like a home page, there's all these hyperlinks, click to later. So to use some of these tools, practice the tools later, read some of the books, get books on, books on CDs, etc. So make it an ongoing practice. Here's an idea that I've found to be incredibly helpful. Creating an ecosystem that supports you. It's sort of like this. Imagine you bought this beautiful orchid from the rainforest and you put it in your house. Unless you have a really steamy house, it's not going to thrive. And there's nothing wrong with the orchid. It's just that's not its environment. And I believe oftentimes one of the reasons why so many people feel fatigued and they don't have that juiciness in life is they've tried to force fit themselves into an environment that doesn't really suit who they are? And so I want to ask you to think about that. Have I created an environment in all aspects of my life that allows me to flourish? And in the appendix, I've got some questions to help you in that search. And from personal experience, I really believe that's one of the most important things that we can do to bring more energy and vitality and joy in our lives. And that in itself is worth the effort, but also the more energy and vitality and joy, the less likely we are to sweat the small stuff, so we're not stressed out day in and day out, and the more energy we have to bring to bear when faced with challenges. Related to an environment, creating an ecosystem in which we can thrive, is making sure we're feeling connected with our mission, our purpose on earth. I remember years ago, the poet David White talking about the transition he made from being part of a nonprofit to going out into the big world of being a poet and speaking to corporate America. And those of you at the Cancer Community Center can relate to that, and any other folks in nonprofits. He said, if you really want to kill yourself, work at a nonprofit. There's never-ending supply of work to be done. And he just was finding himself feeling really beleaguered and worn out and exhausted. And he sought solace from a friend and mentor of his, Brother David Stendelrast, who's a Benedictine monk. And he asked Brother David for just some wisdom around exhaustion. Like, what's up with this? What do I need to know? And he said he was amazed by what Brother David said, because he didn't say what David White expected. He didn't say the antidote to exhaustion is rest. He said the antidote to exhaustion is wholeheartedness. And then oftentimes why we're exhausted is our heart is not in it. Our heart is not in our work. Our work is not part of our mission. And so again, from personal experience, I believe one of the most important things for us questions to ask is, am I really connected with my mission and purpose here? Am I on a path with, there's a book, The Path with a Heart, or The Path with Heart? And so asking yourself that. And it's so wild when you know you're connected with your mission, just you feel filled with energy. And actually sort of related to that in the ecosystem piece, here's something that you might want to do during lunch or during the breaks. It'll be a fun way for you to connect up with somebody new, is to ask them, what's something that just brings you alive, that you just feel so alive and psyched doing? So for me, it's surfing. I'm curious, any surfers in the crowd? All right, yeah. Trying, good for you. It's like you're floating on air when you're catching a wave. It is the most unbelievably cool experience. And so just thinking about surfing, I get all pumped up. And so what I encourage you to do is have that conversation with somebody and notice both how you come alive when you talk about something that you're so passionate about and how they come alive. And so part of not only having an enjoyable life, but having energy and vitality to face challenges is tapping into that well of my heart's in my life. I'm connected with my mission. Viewing your life as a hero's journey. I'm just going to give you the Reader's Digest condensed version of this. I have a whole CD on this, but I just want to give you a little bit because this model adds so much mystery and fascination to life as well as courage during difficult times. How many of you know who Joseph Campbell was? All right. He was a mythology scholar. And in studying myths across cultures, he found that regardless of the culture, there was a common theme. Every culture had this theme, which he called the hero's journey. And it's everywhere because it's everywhere in our experience. We all have our experience of the hero's journey. And it goes like this. Again, this is Reader's Digest condensed version. The hero's living an average everyday life. They're unremarkable. And they're in a village or in an ancient city. And then they get what Campbell called the call to adventure. We hear it as that still small voice inside that's asking you to listen. And oftentimes the hero doesn't want to listen because isn't it scary sometimes? We're like little kids, like, nah, 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 I can't hear it. You know, we did that as kids. We try to ignore that still small voice. But oftentimes, if we don't listen, life increases the intensity of the call. Some of you have been aware of that. Isn't that true? I've got a travel alarm. It starts off really nice, and if you don't shut it off, it gets more and more insistent. And that's until it's like boom, bam, bam. That's kind of how life is. Well, finally, the hero, somewhere in the early or the later stages of the call, crosses the threshold into the unknown. And they're in the great wilderness, in uncharted territory. And they start to experience big challenges far greater than in their simple little life. But also, fortunately, they come across helpers. And some of those helpers are disguised as very scary creatures or maybe a witch. But that scary creature or that witch actually has exactly the message they need to hear. I want to pause for a second. One of the things about the hero's journey that makes it so fascinating and exciting is to imagine you are on your hero's journey right now, and somebody might tell you something today that is exactly what you need to hear to take that next step or to have the courage to do what that still small voice is saying. And I just want to share this example with you because it is so magical and awesome. And actually, it's from Fran. I asked Fran if I could share this. When she was thinking about stepping away from her very successful field in advertising and going into this new world, that, you know, it's always challenging to step into the unknown, especially if this part was working really well. And so Fran was at a McDonald's, and one of her daughters was playing in that, you know, the thing with all the balls and everything. So Hannah's playing in there. And all of a sudden, Fran turns around, and there's this elderly couple sitting at her table. Like, okay. And almost as if they were just continuing the conversation they had been having, the couple said, yeah, and you know, you never have to worry about the future. And Fran's like, oh, hi. And then they begin to talk, and even though they're elderly, they acted like they were like newlyweds. They're just so bubbly and happy. And the wife says something like, yeah, it's so amazing that we always thought we would never be able to afford to retire because he's a pastor, you know, never made much money, never able to save money, getting older, and thought, okay, that's not going to happen. And then one day there's a knock at the door. And there's this guy at the door, and he said he's an attorney for this man who willed his whole estate to us. And this man said that he walked into the church one time, wasn't a member of the church, and my husband's sermon was so inspiring to him, it changed his life. And he wanted to thank him for that. And they're like, isn't that so cool? Isn't that so amazing? And so again, they look at Fran, it's like, yeah, so you never have to worry about the future. Fran's like, thank you. And so have that, you are on your hero's journey, attentiveness to be on the lookout for that person who's right there in that moment to give you the message that you need. And so what happens with the hero, because they're attentive, and they pick up on these clues and these cues, they come full circle back to the village or the ancient city, and they have so much more to give because of those challenges and who they became on that journey. And the last part that I want to mention, or guiding principle about receptivity, relates to being attentive. And that's part of being on your hero's journey. And so I want to end off, before I just do a super quick wrap up, with this story. And this is the benefit that thinking about, I am on a hero's journey, can have in terms of gathering clues and wisdom. And it's actually a story that a friend happened to a friend, and then since then I've had it happen to me. So here's what happened. She was at a big multi-day conference. And it was a great conference, but you get kind of worn out after a while. And so at the end of the day, she goes to her hotel room, and she just wants to rest. She's just tired. You know how sometimes it's like you just want to rest. You want to recuperate. And so she takes the little electronic key and slides it on the door and cranks on it, and it doesn't quite go, which is no biggie. Technology is often not perfect, so she does it again, and it's not working. She does it again, and she starts to feel frustrated. It's like, I just want to lay down. I don't need this aggravation. And you know how when you feel kind of weary after a while, maybe it's you've tried to start up this business and it ain't working, or maybe looking for a relationship and you really want to be in a relationship with this person and it's not seeming to work out, or maybe the next promotion at work, the next level up in the organization, and it's not happening. And that's what's going on with her. And especially when you feel tired, it's like, give me a break. So she does it a few more times and just getting more and more frustrated. And then finally she takes a deep breath and she kind of steps back. And of course, what does she realize? Exactly, I'm at the wrong door. And so she goes, oh yeah, right, the right door. Oh, amazing. The door opens with ease. Now, if we're just speeding through life, oblivious to life, that's just kind of like, oh yeah, boy, I was kind of a dummy then. But when you realize you're on a heroic journey, you can look at simple events like that and extract wisdom. And so that simple moment in a life, think about what that means in your own life. How often have you tried to engineer a result? This is my goal. This is how it's going to be. You've got the 10-point plan. You've got the success map on the refrigerator, whatever that is. And you're like yanking on the door and it's not opening. But if we step back, take a breath, and practice being receptive to what life is asking us of us, receptive to that still small voice. And I'm sure you've had times in your life when you've done that, and it's like, oh yeah, the door opens so much easier when you do that. So I hope you use the hero's journey, or I call it typically the mythic journey, but you use that as a way to bring more mystery and excitement into your life, as well as to remember that all heroes were basically average, everyday John and Jane Does. And so you've got that hero archetype in you. So putting this into action, practice instant perspective, pay attention to your thoughts and use the handouts for challenging them. Tune your brain to look for those gifts and opportunities. Choose challenge in simple everyday things. Practice, practice, practice. Create your nourishing ecosystem. So paying attention to what brings you alive, what brings you joy. Connect or reconnect with your purpose, your mission, and feel that excitement well up inside of you. And see your life as a hero's journey. And then practice listening to that still small voice. And so as we practice these things and become more resilient, not only are we able to deal with day-to-day demands and pressures without getting all stressed out, but when we're faced with change, challenge, and uncertainty, we have the bring it on attitude. Thank you. Bye.